Hello, this video will show one more example of creating a method. In this case, I will create a method that has both a non-void return type and um, an input parameter. And this video will also show an example of overloading methods. I'm going to build on my previous code, so the Dice Games application from the Chapter 7 Part 2 video, and I'll create a new version of the roll dice method that I created in that video. So that original roll dice method had no parameters, and I'm going to create a new version of the same method that does have input parameters. So this will demonstrate both ways to create that method, and it will also demonstrate the concept of overloading methods. So back in my code, this is the same code where I left off from part 2. I'm first of all going to add some comments. So I am invoking here the method that I created that rolls the dice and returns a dice number. Okay. And here I invoke the method I created to see if the dice number rolled equals 6 and display a corresponding win or lose message. Okay. All right, so down here, what we're doing in this method was we were checking whether the first input matches the second input. Okay, so whatever you saved your dice number as, and then whatever you're matching it to, whether that's a literal number 6 or whether that's something input by the user. It's going to take whatever those two numbers are, see if they match, print the win if they match, print the lose if they didn't. So that's the review of where we got to in the part 2 video. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to add something else to our form. Let's say that in addition to this text box, we're going to have another text box that lets the user decide how many sides the dice has. So most dice have 6 sides, but if you're familiar with different types of games, you've probably seen some other, like I've seen 10-sided dice and 12-sided dice. So we're going to say in our example that when you play Guess the Number, you're also allowed to specify how many sides on the dice. But in this example, we're going to say that you can only specify that for the guessing game. Okay, so we have 2 games here. We have one game where you just play on a regular 6-sided dice and you just see if you roll a 6. Then we have another game where you can guess a number and you can specify how many sides are on the dice and you can play the game. So back in our code, as we have it now, when the user rolls the dice, a number between 1 and 6 is generated. But we could create another version of this method, and this is called overloading a method. When you create a method where the header, including the identifier, is exactly the same, but you provide a variation of the parameter list, that is the concept of overloading a method. So we're basically defining two versions of this roll dice method. Then when we invoke the method, the application will be able to tell which version to run based on the type of input that we put in. So in this case, we're going to say, in our original version, the dice always was rolled the exact same way and returned a number between 1 and 6. Here we want to say, well, I want to input how many sides the dice should have, or in other words, a number between 1 and whatever the user inputs. So we're just going to define a generic integer variable. We'll just call it x. And here we're going to have it do almost the exact same thing. So I'm going to copy and paste this code. Except in this case, instead of a number between 1 and 7, we want to generate a number between 1 and whatever the user input. So x. Actually plus 1, because of that pesky thing where it's an exclusive limit, right? When it was 6, so if we input 6 as the input parameter to our method, then this would be generate a number 1 through 7 exclusive, just exactly the same as we have up here. So because our number generator, your second input always has to be 1 higher than the number you want, that's why I've added the plus 1 here. So if we wanted a 10-sided dice, the user input 10, then here that would be a number, a random number generated between 1 and 10. So now we have two versions of the roll dice method. If the user, when they invoke the method, does not include anything in the parentheses, then C# will execute this version of the method. If when I invoke the method, I put a number in the parentheses, then C# will execute this version of the method. So up here in my play sixes game, I want it to just roll the dice, standard default dice between 1 and 6. I don't want to specify a different number of sides for the dice. So I'm going to use this version of the method. In my guess game, I don't want just the standard 6-sided version. I want to roll a dice of however many sides the user input. So what I can do is I can input an integer into my parentheses. So the way that we've written this version of the method is that you can input whatever number you input inside the parentheses represents the number of sides. So I could even, to be more descriptive, instead of calling it x, I could change that to be number of sides. And change this x to be number of sides as well. So then up here, when I actually invoke that method, if I wanted the dice to roll a number between 1 and 10, I'd put the number 10. In this case, I don't want it to be a specific number. I want it to be whatever the user input. So I am going to first collect user input about how many sides, and then roll a dice that has that many sides. Okay. So up here, collecting the input from the user is just going to be an integer. I'll call it number of dice sides, and that will be whatever the user input in this text box, which I should rename to be the sides text box. So then back in my code, I collect from the user the number of sides that they input. I convert that to an integer. Save it as the number of dice sides. Then when I go to write my statement that rolls the dice, instead of just having the standard 6-sided dice, I'm going to use the other version of the roll dice method where I can input a number into the parentheses. And in this case, instead of a specific number, I don't want to roll a 6-sided dice or a 10-sided dice. I want to roll a dice that has however many sides the user input. Now if I run my code, run my application, this button will still always generate a number between 1 and 6. Down here, I could say I want it to be 10-sided dice. So now it will generate a number between 1 and 10. And I'll only win when it matches the number that I input.